This is Steve Zeltzer with Pacifica, and we're talking with Dave Van Deusen, and he is the president of the Vermont Labor Council. And maybe you can introduce yourself, David, talk about where you're from and who you are and your background.
My name is David Van Deusen. I'm president of the Vermont AFL-CIO. I've been involved with the labor movement for 20 plus years now. I've come out of most recently as vice president position for the Northeast Kingdom Central Labor Council and was elected to president in 2019. So I'm a Vermonter, engaged in every day, live and breathe the labor movement, and we find ourselves in difficult times and we want to do our part.
And there have been some actions by labor councils around the country, Southeast Wisconsin, Madison, the Seattle Labor Council, raising the issue of labor action to defend democracy if President Trump refused to leave. Apparently, he's still making moves that he wants to stay in regardless of the results of the election. Why don't you talk about how you came to the conclusion that your state federation had to act and the issues that brought you to that conclusion?
Before the election, before November 3rd, our own senator, who we have a very good relationship with, Bernie Sanders, you may have heard of him, he was trumpeting in public, being a siren, a warning that he felt the signs were there, that even with Trump losing the election, he would seek to stay in office. We took those warnings very seriously as a labor council. We had a number of discussions with our collective leadership on our executive board and on our presidential advisory board. We feel very strong, and we felt very strong that we had to be prepared to act. These are unprecedented times. Perhaps a general strike is fairly unprecedented in recent times, but so is a coup. That has not happened before. So we brought the question to our members. We did not want 11 people on a board, even though we're elected, making such decisions without involving the rank and file. We brought a resolution authorizing a strike, a call for a strike, to our convention, which occurred on November 21st. And we debated and discussed it for a good. We heard from many different rank and file people. We heard from many different unions and different points of view. And at the end of the day, our members feel the same way as I do, that we must defend democracy at all costs. And they overwhelmingly voted to authorize us, their executive board, to call for a general strike here in Vermont if Trump refuses to leave the White House and if we are in a coup type situation. We must defend democracy.
And the issue of defense of democracy, the AFL-CIO, you got a letter from President Trumpka challenging your action. What was your response to that? What do you think about that?
I'm not inclined at the moment to make comments about the internal workings of the AFL-CIO. I spoke on a phone call some weeks ago after the election with President Trumpka. I asked him point blank if we are prepared as an organization for a national general strike in the event of a coup. He personally told me that no options are off the table. So here in Vermont, we're doing what we have to do. You don't snap your fingers and have a general strike. It takes hard work to do this in preparation and organizing. We have the authorization from our members to do such work in preparation. We are doing that now. We're going to focus on key communities, definitely our largest city, Burlington, and other communities around the state as well. We've already engaged in the political discussion with elected leaders, and we very strongly feel that if there is a coup, we will not be standing alone. We will be standing with many allies, including elected officials here in Vermont.
And we're talking with Dave Van Deusen, who is president of the Vermont AFL-CIO. Now, in your some of your letters that you put out, you mentioned the kind of crisis that working people labor is facing, the COVID situation, the massive budget cuts that are coming. State and local governments may be going bankrupt. I just heard that 9,000 workers, transit workers in New York City, may face a layoff. I mean, this is for working people, cataclysmic situation with public services being cut, healthcare workers in the midst of a pandemic.
Yes.
What needs to be done? Because it seems like people are waiting for something to happen. Uh,
Mhm.
and that just waiting for something to happen is not necessarily going to solve the problems that working people are facing in this country.
We're facing a 1930s type situation with the unprecedented levels of unemployment that we have now, the pandemic raging and on the rise everywhere. This is a crisis situation. Put on top of that, a potential coup, and we have never seen anything like this in the history of the United States. So we know what the answer is. We need a New Deal type recovery. There's economic recovery. There is no two ways about it. Even if we get the vaccine out and distributed by the spring, we are still going to be in serious economic trouble. So we need to see massive public investment in our infrastructure, in our schools, in our communities. We need that to come from the feds, and where the feds won't lead, we need the states to lead. In Vermont, the AFL-CIO, we've been fighting to get Green New Deal on the agenda and aspects of Green New Deal here in our capital, Montpelier, and we need that fight to happen in Washington as well. We need to pressure Biden. Once we get him in the White House, we need to be sure to keep up the fight and keep up the struggle to make sure he follows through what he said on the campaign trail. And that should not be taken for granted.
And particularly in relationship to healthcare, we don't have national healthcare. Millions of people who've lost their jobs are being thrown off their healthcare plans because it's privately run. Yet it doesn't seem like Biden is really raising the call that in this pandemic, this national emergency, that the right to have healthcare seems to be a basic human right in the midst of a pandemic.
Absolutely. And again, our labor federation is a firm supporter of single payer. That's what we need. But we're not going to make progress on single payer, on a Green New Deal, on livable wages, any of it, unless we put serious pressure on the capitalist class and on the Democratic Party. So even if we get Trump thrown out of office, which the voters said we have to do, and we have to do whatever it takes to get him out, even after that, we're only going to make progress with this Democratic Party if we are pressuring them. We need to be in the streets. We need to have an outside game, and we need to have a long game. The days of us relying on backroom deals with big wigs from the Democratic Party should need to be over. That strategy has failed. It has failed time and time again, and we cannot allow ourselves to be lulled into subservience under a new administration. So the struggle will be very real. We need to see unions being active on levels that are unprecedented in this country since the Great Depression. And that's what it's going to take to win.
And the issue of democracy, some unions are very top-down, corporate structured. I know that the state Fed in Vermont has opened itself up to rank and file members. Talk about the issue of democracy, why democracy and democratic labor movement is critical to deal with the issues that we're dealing with today.
Look, I'm president of the Vermont AFL-CIO. I could sit here with you and make all the proclamations in the world and they could sound great. If we don't have buy-in from the rank and file, if they weren't part of the process to get to where we're suggesting what the solutions are, then why would we think they're going to be active with us when we have to be in the streets and doing workplace actions to achieve them? We need democracy, not just in this vague representational way, talking about Washington, D.C. and going to a ballot box and privately voting every few years. We need to build a very deep democracy within our labor movement if we're going to get the kind of buy-in and the kind of action needed out of the millions of union members in this country in order to make fundamental social change in this country. That is hard because a lot of our inherited structures and bylaws are frankly not very democratic. At our last convention, where we passed the general strike authorization vote, we also passed a number of constitutional changes to our labor body. We want to be an example for the country to expand the amount of delegates, to expand the amount of participation that we'll have in these decision-making bodies and in these conventions. But we need to do this not in one state, not in two. We need to do this in the United States of America.
And what kind of response have you received from other union bodies around the country?
I've got a good number of messages from folks around the country. Now, we are working in conjunction with a number of unions throughout the United States, including the CTU and the UE, in a coalition to defend democracy against Trump coup. So we have open lines of communications outside the traditional channels that you would go to. So those discussions are happening union to union, leader to leader, rank and file to rank and file throughout the continent right now. We need to deepen those, and perhaps we should start thinking about a labor summit, not just an AFL-CIO summit, but a summit of all labor to get together to talk about what we need to do, not only to defend democracy, but to transform our economy and build our democracy in a more deep and thorough way across the whole land.
The issue of education, I mean, the corporate media pretty much dominate the landscape, whether right or left. There is no Labor Party. There is no labor media in this country, labor channel. There are golf channels, there are religious channels, but there's not even a national labor channel. And what is going to bring that about? Because it seems there's a political vacuum from the point of view of working people in this country, where education issues, deregulation, privatization, healthcare, all these issues are not being framed by the labor movement itself.
You're right, and part of that's on labor. But like all the polls we see in the mainstream media, the polls we see in what is acceptable political discourse in this country fluctuate between neo-fascist, which is the Trump administration right now, and neoliberal, which brought us NAFTA, mandatory minimums, and quote-unquote welfare reform. And it's within this right-wing framework that issues are debated. But labor plays into that. Big labor often will align itself. They'll have critiques, interesting critiques at times, of the neoliberal agenda. But we have a fear, institutionally, of breaking with that to create alternatives. I think we could look at Vermont as another example. It's Bernie Sanders doesn't emerge in the national scene out of a vacuum. For decades here in Vermont, we've been working to broaden those alternatives. We have a functioning third party here who presently occupies the lieutenant governor's seat, called the Vermont Progressive Party. It's essentially a social democratic party. We work very close, labor works hand in glove with them here in Vermont, and we need to build things like that out on the national scale. I'm heartened to know that the Democratic Socialist America now has about 85,000 members nationwide, still not even a fraction of what we're gonna need if we're gonna build viable political alternatives to the two moderate to right-wing parties in this country. But this is a long project, but we need to start it now.
And, you know, Bernie Sanders has said that he's interested in being Secretary of Labor. At the same time, the Biden administration apparently is going to bring in Republicans or conservatives into his administration. What does that mean for labor if you have a cabinet that includes corporatists or Republicans or people that don't have a labor agenda and don't have a history of supporting workers and labor?
Well, look, we absolutely support Bernie. We think he would make a great pick for Secretary of Labor. But we need to see who Biden's going to pick throughout his cabinet. Now, from my point of view, we don't need reconciliation. We need to win. And when I say win, it's time for labor to not just be invited to an event here and there, but to have deep policy say in what happens politically in this country. Biden has a choice to make right now of whether or not we go back to the way it was under Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, which, let's not kid ourselves, we did not make big advancements during those periods. Or we could start a new path, a new way, a pro-labor way, something akin to what we saw under FDR. Now, we will see what happens, but we can't just hope for the best and have no game plan. We need to be unified. We need to be working with our allies outside of the AFL-CIO, and we need to be in the streets, and we need to be willing to take workplace actions, political actions, whatever it takes to advance our agenda.
And the role of Trump in inciting right-wingers, Proud Boys, these fascist gangs, armed fascist gangs around the country, he seems he's given them an okay to incite people, use racist ideology, and threaten people even physically with weapons. That is not going to go away.
No.
Regardless of who's in the White House.
It won't. And let's be real. The best case scenario is that enough pressure is brought to bear where Trump does not go the next step with his coup. Trump is removed from office. This is the best case scenario. And under that case scenario, there will be low-grade violence emanating from fascists across this country for the next 4 years plus. That is a fact. We've seen that happen already in the Pacific Northwest. We've seen it in the Midwest. We've seen that trend develop over the last 4 years. And what started off as lone wolf attacks, think of the guy in Florida with the pipe bombs, has become organized groups taking violent acts, which is a very qualitatively different thing. Labor needs to be prepared to defend the left, to defend workers, to defend unions in the face of violence. And that's not going to be a peaceful sit-in. We need to do whatever it takes to make sure our members and those who are fighting for progressive change are made to feel safe. Here in Vermont, we are in the works of chartering a union motorcycle club who would have some security responsibilities in the event that a threat was posed to us. But we need to take those violent threats from fascists very seriously. They're more emboldened now than they ever have been in our country leading up until World War II. And we cannot take it for granted that the state will keep us safe. This is on us to do, and we can do it, and we will do it.
And they have talked about a civil war, these groups, these right-wing groups, that they want one, they expect one, and they're getting ready for it. What is that all about?
Look, I'm not going to pretend that I can comprehend the psychology of these lunatics. But when they say such things, what does it translate to? It translates to these plots like we saw in Michigan about kidnapping the governor. It translates into people getting shot at protests, like the Rittenhouse case. It translates into more violence in the streets against protesters like we've seen in Portland. And those are very real. But we can't take that sitting down. We, as labor, as the left, we need to stand up. We need to defend our friends. We need to defend working people. We need to defend our allies. And force at times needs to be met with force.
And the issue of the money that's being spent in the United States for the military, $750 billion. I mean, here we have our infrastructure falling apart. People don't have health care. People don't have housing. Yet we're spending a massive amount of money for the military. And Trump says he's going to bring the troops back from Afghanistan and Iraq, but we have 800 bases around the world. It seems like this empire, which is the United States, is in a great crisis. And that yet the Democrats and Republicans both say we want to continue to maintain this military empire. Does that make sense in this present situation?
Well, look, I have great respect for those that serve in our military. Many of my friends and colleagues are serving now and have served, family members, etc. Both my grandparents served in the war against fascism in World War II. But we could cut our military budget in half and still be a million light years ahead of any other country in the world as far as military strength goes. It is an absolute waste of money. It is absolute travesty that when we have homeless veterans on the street, we are pumping more money into the military than every other country in the world combined. So yes, there has to be a readjustment, but the Democrats or the Republicans, left to their own devices, are not going to do that. The military-industrial complex has a system of rewards built into it, corporate rewards. So again, we could talk about so many different issues in this country, but unless we pressure folks from the bottom, from the actual rank and file all the way up, we're not going to get changed just by changing who's sitting in Washington, D.C.
And the last general strike in the United States was in 1946 in Oakland. There were general strikes in Minneapolis and in San Francisco in 34. There hasn't been a mass workers movement in the United States since the 30s and 40s. Do you see that changing really because of this crisis, this dire situation, the possibility of a coup?
Yes. Now, we've also never seen a coup type situation in the United States. And we haven't seen an economic crisis like this since the Great Depression, when labor activity was very high. So activity among working people is largely driven by external factors. And the external factor in this case is not only the political situation, but also the economic situation. So we've already seen people getting more active. Let's think about the wildcat strikes that have sprung up over safety at places like Amazon, which are not union. So we're seeing this all throughout multi-sectors of the economy right now. But we need to coalesce around that. We need to find ways to support those movements, to grow those movements, and to grow our solidarity among movements.
And in the companies like Amazon, Bezos, the gig economy, it seems like this, for workers now who are being marginalized, they have no choice but these gig type jobs. And Amazon, the growth of Amazon threatens the Teamsters. UPS threatens union jobs. So in California recently, they spent, Uber and Lyft spent over $200 million for a ballot initiative to prevent workers from getting unemployment, workers' compensation. It seems like this is the economic trend right now in a mass way in the United States and internationally.
Well, look, we could pass, they can pass with their money all the laws they want. Let's not forget that we did not have a legal right to strike in this country until the 1930s. And we got that because we were unified. We stood together and we did it, right? So that's how we build power. It's not because of words on paper. Words on paper are just words on paper. We need to be willing, able to carry out actions based around unity, based around workers' power. And the laws will follow after that. But if we need to have our shit together, we need to be strong and we need to be united to make those changes.
And was your convention videotaped? Is it going to be available to workers around the country?
It was taped. We have not decided whether or not to make it public. We would want to have more consultation with the locals involved because we did encourage a very robust and open debate internally. Mm-hmm. We would want to be respectful for the privacy of those points of view. So no, we haven't made a decision on that yet. But generally speaking, if I had to make a mistake, I'd rather do it on the side of transparency than non-transparency.
And you seem to say that we need a national debate, national discussion on labor throughout the country, all unions, all working people.
Absolutely. Absolutely, we do. For too long, we've been in silos, right? SEIU and their partners on one side, AFL-CIO on another, UEAD, a number of independent unions on their own. We need to be coming together. We need to have a national discussion about how we coordinate our efforts, transform internally to become stronger, and then seek to transform the political environment in the broader country.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with Dave Van Deusen. He's president of the state AFL-CIO in Vermont, and they passed a historic resolution, really, this past weekend at their national convention, saying that the threat of a coup now requires that labor take seriously and prepare for action to defend democratic rights in the United States and the people of the United States. So thanks for joining us on Pacifica.
Thanks, Steve. See you on the picket lines.